Welcome to the Tension Podcast. I'm your host, Donna DuPont with the Archipelago of Design. Joining me today is Simon Wells and Tiffany Leung. Simon is a Canadian emergency manager and program manager who has worked in public safety at multiple levels of government. In 2020, Simon founded the Canadian Journal of Emergency Management. Tiffany Leung is a Canadian emergency management practitioner with expertise in Indigenous humanitarian evacuations. She has worked across multiple levels of government and critical infrastructure sectors. Tiffany has been serving as the Director of Business Operations for the Canadian Journal of Emergency Management. Welcome, Simon and Tiffany, to the podcast.
Thank you for having us, Donna.
So, tell us a little bit about the Canadian Journal of Emergency Management, or otherwise known as CJEM, the type of work you do, as part of the journal.
Well, CJEM is a product of the pandemic. We incorporated it in May 2020, but the ideation for the journal actually started before the pandemic. So it was timely, but it's not a reaction to the global COVID-19 pandemic. Our vision is really to sustain and to nurture a national dialogue on disaster and emergency management. So our practice of emergency management in Canada flourishes. It is a systemic intervention into what has recently been a lack of resources and a lack of education and training for emergency managers who hold incredibly important roles in their community. And a lack of place or space for them to communicate as practitioners with policymakers and with scholars, and vice versa, with scholars and policymakers to share their important insights with practitioners to make their work better. And so we really focus on escalating and sharing technical and research excellence across those communities of practice. And we focus on creating and operating a forum in which those communities can influence and inform doctrine and policy and practice of emergency management.
That's wonderful. So was this journal, it sounds like it was filling in a gap in the system for continuous learning and training that's coming from within the profession. Is that correct?
I would say so. It's important to note that there are really incredible and experienced knowledge mobilizers in disaster and emergency management who precede us, and we have a ton of respect and some great partnerships with and for all of those organizations. There's organizations like the Canadian Risk and Hazards Network and their publication HazNet Magazine. Mm-hmm. There's publications like True North Magazine, which is the latest publication to hit the scene, and that's a product of Disaster Recovery Institute Canada. There's the Emergency Preparedness in Canada podcast. So, lots of great knowledge mobilizers, not just limited to that list, who are already focused on sharing, new insights and improving emergency management. The difference is that we have an editorial process. And so our editorial process, our peer review process, allows us to validate knowledge to a different extent than those other mobilizers. And that's just different. It's neither better or worse than any other type. It's a different type of knowledge for a different purpose.
That's fantastic. And you were saying that a lot of the content is really produced or published to support policy and strategy going forward, within Canada and perhaps even beyond too.
Yeah, we're really focused on the practice of emergency management in Canada. And that means that we're interested in escalating the insights of practitioners, their hard-earned lessons learned, to scholars and to policymakers to help them focus on emerging problems and new and wicked problems. But we're equally interested in sharing the new and novel insights of those scholars and those policymakers with practitioners in an impactful and pragmatic way, so that practitioners can immediately incorporate these new insights into their programs at perhaps a municipal or a provincial level.
That's great. That's excellent. Wonderful. So thank you for explaining the background of CJEM for our audience who may not be aware of the journal and all the great work that you're doing. So I understand you had a specific engagement grant under the Mines program to do some work around climate change and security. Can you tell us a little bit more, or tell us a bit about that project and what that was about?
Absolutely, yeah. So at the beginning of 2024, we embarked on a targeted engagement program in partnership with the Department of National Defense. Now, we're not just focused on security or military affairs. We're really focused holistically on disaster and emergency management in Canada. But one of the most pressing problems nationwide is reliance on the Canadian Armed Forces and the request for federal assistance process. And so, it's really important as climate disaster increases and speeds up that we are all thinking about ways we can mitigate the need for limited federal resources, specifically for the Canadian Armed Forces, which has its own, fulsome military and security mission set beyond domestic operations. Not that the CAF, endeavors to say no to its communities, the communities in Canada, but it's really important that we focus on empowering emergency managers to not have to rely on a force of last resort. So we embarked on this program of engagement throughout 2024, and we hosted 4 webinars and a policy workshop in Ottawa in partnership with the Canadian Emergency Preparedness and Climate Adaptation Expo, hosted by DMG Events. And we had what I would characterize as wildly successful engagement. We engaged with a total of 979 participants, be that speakers, panelists, or viewers of webinars, and that immediately shared new insights across the country. We had representation on our panels and workshops from 9 out of 13 provinces and territories, and that did include territorial representation. We did an excellent job of engaging with a number of really interesting topics like the use of data and technology and innovation, empowering communities, resilience, and the overlap between institutional resilience and business continuity and disaster and emergency management in this new volatile climate environment, and then finally Arctic security implications for disaster and emergency management. So it was a really exciting year and a really exciting and engaging program.
Wow, that's a lot of territory to cover within those 4 workshops. That's incredible. So I take it with these workshops, you were engaging with local practitioners and really getting their insights on what's happening in the system, like that holistic approach that you were talking about, what's changing and what that means for emergency management going forward.
Yeah, we really intentionally reached out to municipal emergency managers and to humanitarians, so people who work for non-governmental organizations. And, I should take this opportunity to say that I really had nothing to do with that success. I get to have, good ideas and then farm them out to people who do actual work. And so Tiffany Leung, who's joining us today, as well as a whole project team led by Alexander Landry, includes our current operations manager, Sarah Harlow, and a number of staff and volunteers from CJEM. They executed that entire program. They did a fantastic job.
That's fantastic. That's great. It does take a team effort for something that large. So that's wonderful. So tell me, with those all across those engagements, what were some of the top things you learned about just climate change and its impact across emergency and disaster management in Canada?
Yeah, maybe I'll start off and I'll ask Tiffany for her insights from the policy workshop that we held in Ottawa as our kind of climactic event. But I can tell you that I'm quite happy to hear that there's a thirst for knowledge across Canada for disaster and emergency management. I think the biggest takeaway that we found is there's a need for a national knowledge sharing platform, that emergency managers across Canada are hungry for the lessons learned that come from other communities or regions perhaps, or other organizations that experience large scale disruptions, and that we need to do a better job of cross-pollinating that information across Canada, because we really in many ways act as kingdoms of their own, as opposed to sharing widely. And I don't think that's for lack of desire, but a lack of a mechanism.
Yeah.
There's also a desire for new knowledge, specifically non-traditional and especially Indigenous knowledge, for dealing with climate adaptation and climate change acceleration and the myriad risks and consequences associated with that. And then I think there's also some opportunities to build on new initiatives or existing initiatives that the government is already pursuing. I don't want to be solely critical of levels of government and their leadership. The push for humanitarian workforce programming is a positive one, and we found that there was a need for even more capacity for some type of national volunteer registry, or perhaps for an expanded program that actually adds further capacity to the existing humanitarian workforces that are already there. So, not all is not lost. There's definitely work being done to go in the right direction from a policy and program perspective. And I wonder what Tiffany might want to add on the workshop side.
It was quite interesting it was actually quite interesting during the workshop, because we also had a multitude of stakeholders just from across the board in critical infrastructure sectors, especially the private sector. And they brought a very different perspective, just being able to mobilize their resources rather quickly. And that comes with the budgeting and the financing that they have behind some of their resources. And so some of the topics that we explored at a roundtable was, how do we better incorporate public and private partnerships before crisis? Because that's when the cost of resources go up for last minute mobilization. But if we're able to build those partnerships with stakeholders and have a service level agreement or a memorandum of understanding in place where you can quickly activate that, it would help lessen the burden on mobilizing our Canadian Armed Forces resources. And a lot of times this happens during the wildfire season, which has been increasing over the last 5 years, from what I've seen, and even on my own personal deployments, but as well as flooding. And oftentimes in Canada, we find ourselves back to back with these sort of hazards that we're dealing with. So as we move from spring flooding, we're moving into fire season. And so we're also putting a strain on our resources, being able to have that sustainability, not just from an armed forces perspective, but also a civilian volunteer registry. And so where are we able to create, again, those partnerships with the private sector to be able to enhance some of that response capability within Canada?
That's great. That's so important to have those types of partnerships across different sectors, and to not work in silos. I'm curious. You mentioned that you had engaged a lot of emergency managers at the municipal level. Do you see any kind of opportunity going forward to engage local communities in terms of preparedness prior to emergencies, and that enhanced awareness at the civilian level?
Yeah, sorry, Simon, did you want to answer that?
Go ahead, please.
It's a really great question, because that was also one of those other topics that we explored, and we had a really great facilitator with us as well, Scott Cameron, and we talked about a whole of society approach. And I know that emergency preparedness in Ontario starts at the individual level, and we talk about 72-hour preparedness kits, but we also learned that there are socioeconomic factors that play into certain communities being able to, one, either have those preparedness resources or having a language and cultural barrier. And so how do you bridge those gaps? And one of those strategies were to work with faith-based organizations and being able to have that broader outreach from a trusted source. And I think one of the biggest issues that we deal with, and being a very multicultural country, is when we have immigrants coming in and we're trying to prepare them for the hazards that are so different than where they come from, how do we connect them with a trusted source? Is that your neighbors next door to you, or is that a faith-based organization that you frequent? And so it's building that community of network and really having those partnerships at that local level.
Simon, did you want to add to what Tiffany had just, yeah?
Yeah, that's a fantastic summary. And I would add that, one of the penultimate recommendations that we make in our report to the Department of National Defense, which we hope to publicize at some point, is developing national and provincial preparedness surveys to get a better understanding of those types of very important and emerging preparedness and response needs that we traditionally have not captured in the disaster and emergency management field. And, Donna, you and I know each other. We know that, you have experience in this, extensive experience in this field as well. And, the tendency is to write a general plan about the government's roles and responsibilities, and then 6 to 8 bullet points on what the broad concept of operations is going to be to coordinate an emergency response. And we don't think about those, really, really important and tactical and real, and localized experiences of people. And so when we think about the individual and we think about community, and we spoke extensively about community empowerment throughout this program of engagement, we need to be thinking about what resources and information those communities need. And it may not be the traditional 72 hours in a can of beans messaging. It could very well be translation support, or the cultural competence to be able to engage with communities or subsets of communities in certain ways to encourage them to take action to prepare themselves today or to prepare for uncertainty. An example of an organization that's really good at that is Mississauga's Office of Emergency Management, and their team is a small but mighty team, and they do a ton of engagement with community leaders and faith-based organizations that reach into parts of the community that they're not able to reach to as the face of the government.
Right. So it's building those networks of trust, on an ongoing basis, so that when there is a crisis, people know where to get reliable information from and who to connect with and how to be safe, which is so important. And I agree. I know, as you mentioned, there's vulnerabilities are changing at the local level. So it's always good to take a look at our assessment tools and how are we assessing vulnerability and what are those needs and how do we need to adjust so that we're taking a little bit more of a human-centered or people-centered approach as we're looking at, a holistic approach to emergency and disaster management, which I think would be very powerful moving into the future. So as you were, working through your project, did you uncover any significant tension points in the system that are worth, highlighting because these could escalate in the near term and probably could be, something that could have significant impact on the system?
Yeah, I think there is the fundamental absence of the private sector in disaster and emergency management in all phases of emergency management programs in Canada. And that is not for lack of willingness amongst the private sector. I think they're quite willing to engage with government when given the opportunity to do so, and more importantly, to engage with communities. There are platforms like Emergency Management Logistics Canada, which is a digital startup out of Alberta that's doing a lot of expansion and a lot of piloting of their platform that makes really, socially conscious options available to procure emergency supplies from communities that could be experiencing emergencies themselves. For example, there are other large-scale sort of big box stores, for example, that are willing to engage and provide fair rates on supplies and pre-positioned supplies, as was seen in Hurricane Fiona. So, the private sector is willing to engage, and we don't even do that, frankly, at a basic level, let alone at a more advanced level. We'd had discussion about the Arctic and the possibility of using, low Earth orbit satellites to enhance communications in areas of the country that really do not have any coverage whatsoever, but also to enhance information sharing across very complex and data heavy tools and resources like GIS platforms and just the computers that we use every day to do our jobs in command posts and emergency operations centers and that type of thing. So before we even get to that level of collaboration and the memorandums of agreement and the whatever governance mechanisms we agree on and the cost recovery and all that sort of thing, whatever that looks like, we need to just bring them to the table and have the conversation with them about what that holistic emergency management looks like, and stop being afraid of engaging with the private sector, and recognize that they are parts of the community just as much as residents and just as much as government.
That's a very important insight, because definitely for a whole of society approach, you need to tap into a lot of different resources, and the private sector has a lot of potential resources to support types of responses and emergencies. So I think that's really helpful. Are there any first steps that that came out of your work in terms of how we can start to engage more with private sector and start to take steps towards, building more engagement overall across the system?
Let me throw this to Tiffany to talk about the AAR workshop, and then also the workshop findings in Ottawa, if you don't mind, Tiffany.
Yeah, so when we look at next steps, we are looking at potentially bringing in more practitioners to talk about how we write these AARs and leveraging a national knowledge sharing platform to look at the lessons learned. And oftentimes, like, there is a lot of knowledge and a lot of data out there, but it's just not widely published. And so being able to bring, again, a lot of different stakeholders from private and public sectors, we're able to then learn, hey, what are the strategies that worked well for you for the same type of disaster that we all experience, but maybe in different jurisdictions? And are there things that we can implement or take best practices from to incorporate into our communities? Another thing that we talked about as part of next steps is conducting regular interagency drills, which we often do at a provincial level, but we don't see the partnerships from private sector, whether it be for a lack of invitation or just a lack of, or just not having the time to be able to go and do professional development and relationship building with public and private sectors. So we're really hoping that we see some more of these next steps and having the government support to move forward with these AR workshops or even some of the exercises that we're looking at for interagency drills.
That's great. And so AR, after action, is that action? Yes. Okay. Just wanted to make sure, just in case, some of our audience wasn't familiar with that acronym. And no, that makes a lot of sense, because you definitely want to have some sort of learning platform to capture and to consolidate all the knowledge that's out there, and probably, eventually using some sort of AI feature to help, really speed up the analysis and synthesis of some of the information so that you can use it in different ways. And I think, drills is probably a fantastic way of just practicing, different processes and how different sectors might work together, including the space sector you talked about, Simon, that's an emerging area, and there's just so much growth happening in that space. And it's really interesting with Earth observation. There are charters available at the global level to have access to a lot of that information, but it hasn't really filtered down, as you said, and it's become interoperable at the emergency management level, within municipal or provincial or federal, maybe federal in some countries, but definitely not the local level. So there's such a big opportunity there to have access to, real-time information and access to really important information that can help us make decisions, not just during crisis, but understanding what's changing and how we may have to mitigate going forward, which will help with preparedness planning. So I agree with you. I'm also very interested in the space sector and what it could mean for the future of emergency management and new skills going into the future. I think there's a whole world of opportunity there. So before we wrap up the podcast, do you have any final thoughts you want to share with our audience on the work that you're doing at CJEM and this targeted engagement project?
Absolutely, yeah. We're in a really exciting juncture, because as we record this podcast with you, I'm getting ready to step down after 5 years at the helm of CJEM and hand the reins over to Tiffany, who's going to become the executive director of CJEM. And so she's going to oversee all of the the core operations of the not-for-profit that publishes the journal. So it's an exciting time. We've partnered with York University to access their open journal system, and we now have a continuous intake model. So we're always accepting content, always accepting manuscripts and submissions from potential authors, and willing to work with them. And I would really strongly encourage anybody who is listening and anybody who is interested to bring your complex issues, bring your questions and your curiosity to CJEM. Even in our last question or conversation there, talking about how space relates to all of this. And I would suggest that, disaster and emergency management as a management science applies to almost everything. And I think you and I could have a long and interesting separate podcast about space and human security and technology and critical infrastructure resilience and all that type of thing. So just one example of a keyword that can cue you into hours of fun if you're willing to put the time in to do that. So I'm really excited for CJEM. I'm really excited to see, as was discussed, the after action review workshop, so we can really dig into the details, the gritty details of practice, and escalate those and make them available to the entire community of practice.
Yeah, no, the after action is so important because it's capturing the knowledge and making sense of the learning so that you can, take that forward and make, good decisions, but also understand what the changing environment looks like. So using both points of knowledge to really help make better strategic decisions. So I think that's a wonderful step forward. I've always been fascinated with after action reports. I've always loved capturing them when I used to work in emergency management and making sense of it and having recommendations. So I think this is a fantastic next step for your project, and I'm excited to see, to hear more about it in the future. If our audience would like to get some information on your project, or perhaps where do they go to find information? Will the final report be available?
So you can find our next publication on our website at cdnjem.ca. And there's a link to our open access journal. So what we're doing is we're submitting a final report to the Department of National Defense, and then the report will be broken down by each webinar that we have done for this program, and then a fifth publication for the policy workshop. And that will go through our independent editorial process, which is peer reviewed. And so the publications will come out when that review is done. It's all fact checked, and we have a team of editors behind doing a copy edit as well. And you can also contact our team at info@cdngem.ca, and somebody will get back to you within 2 to 4 business days.
Okay, wonderful. Simon and Tiffany, thank you so much for taking the time today to share your work on today's podcast. And we will definitely put a link to all of the resources that's been highlighted on this podcast in the show notes for the episode.
Thanks for having us, Donna.
Thank you so much.